Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Lord of the Rings LCG progression series, and today is the second video of the mini-series on deck building. And the focus of today's video will be choosing allies. So I've got the hero combination that I used from 3 different decks, and I'll go into how I would choose the allies for each of these decks and what challenge we were trying to overcome with these decks. First, a couple of guidelines. When I first started building decks in this game, as with any game, one of the first things you're wondering about is the ratios. You have different card types, allies, attachments, and events. Once you've chosen your heroes, the first thing you're wondering is, how many of each should I generally use? You have 50 cards or more. And my first thought is, okay, do I need 5 allies and mostly attachments and events? Do I need 30 allies and very few attachments and events? What's generally a good ratio of allies to attachments to events? And there's no hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, I aim for in the neighborhood of 20 allies, give or take, sometimes going as high as 30 or so. If I'm in the neighborhood of 20 to 30, I'm happy. If I'm below 20, I usually will try to add allies to get up to 20. It's only a very specific challenge that I'm tackling where I won't do it. Where, like, if a quest punishes you for using allies, then I won't do that. But in almost every single case, I'm aiming for in the ballpark of 20 to 30 allies. And the rest, attachments and events, is appropriate, which I'll go over in another video. So that's the general guideline that I use if you're a newer player or just looking for a philosophy on deck building to get you started on creating your own decks to overcome the challenges if you don't like net decking. I would start with, as a newer player, aiming for in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 allies. Probably closer to 20. Maybe 20 to 25. Aim for that number, and you'll find you have a reasonable ratio in your decks. So let's go over the first combination of heroes, Bjorn, Celeborn, Glorfindel. This was a deck that I constructed for the quest The Dunland Trap, though I used this combination of heroes in a variety of quests after that, in particular Celeborn and Bjorn. For a variety of Sylvan quests. I think maybe 4, 5, 6 quests, something like that, maybe even 7 or 8. So let's take a look. So we'll pretend for a moment that we're constructing this deck for the Dunland Trap. So I've got my cards selected here on RingsDB with the sets that were available at the time of the release of the Dunland Trap. And I've got my heroes selected, and so now we're going to go into the list of allies that were available at the time. So I know that I'm aiming for in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 allies, and so first I look at, well, with this deck, I selected these heroes with Sylvans in mind. So when I'm building a synergistic deck, first thing I'm going to look at is allies that fit into that synergy. Allies that fit into that synergy and the spheres of the heroes that I've chosen. And the first thing that I look at for deck building, for most quests, it depends, varies from quest to quest, but the first thing I'm looking for is willpower. Because most quests require of you willpower first and then attack / defense. And the reason they require willpower first is because you typically start with some threat against you in the staging area, and if you don't overcome it, you take on threat, and then you engage greater and greater strength enemies, and then you need more and more defense, and your ability to play more willpower is reduced because attacking and defending allies typically are not strong on willpower. So willpower early in solo games is very, very important in almost every quest. There's a few that it's not, but in almost every quest it is, and the Dunland Trap is no different. So I'm prioritizing willpower and my allies above everything else, and as I'm running a synergy in this deck, I'm prioritizing Sylvans and willpower. So we're going through the list, and that immediately rules out a lot of these allies because they have no Sylvan synergy. At least rules them out for the moment. Now, one note on that, you can almost always include Core Gandalf in every deck without thinking about it too much, and this deck is no exception. So we go down the list. Willpower and Sylvan is what we're looking for, and starting with leadership, just because it's on top. And the first one we come to is the Ninth Guide, which has a cost of 2 and will interplay with 2 willpower on the turn that it enters thanks to Celeborn, and 2 cost for 2 willpower is great, so that card is getting included in the deck. There's no other reasoning than that. Looking at willpower first, and anytime I see 2 cost for 2 willpower. Now it's only got 1 willpower after that, but also on the turn that it enters it allows a hero not to exhaust a quest this round, which is usually going to be Celeborn, but it can be Glorfindel if you don't have Light of Valinor out yet, which can save you a threat. So that's a great ally for this deck. Include it, and we'll continue down the list. Now we have Silverlode Archer. It's a Sylvan, but it costs 3 for only 2 willpower. That's less than what we're looking for, so we pass by it for now. But I would include it if I had included all of the allies that I considered good and was still lacking in allies. Skip by the lore allies because we're not playing a lore hero, and it's on to the spirit heroes. First we're looking at Sylvans, and we go down the list and we find Sylvan Refugee, which is 1 cost for 3 willpower on the turn that it enters. That is very strong. Immediately include that. And continue down the list, and as we continue we find there are no good willpower Sylvans in the tactics sphere. So we're finished with that, and we've got only 9 allies, so there's a lot of spots left to fill in. And as I mentioned, I'm looking first to willpower. Once I have, and synergy, and I'm very short on willpower still. If I had all of these allies out, they would likely not be sufficient to accomplish my willpower objectives. In terms of running willpower allies, I love the card Faramir, the ally card. I include it in almost every deck I build. So we'll run him in there for willpower. We're just going over the list now and looking at generally strong allies for willpower. I believe in this deck I run a little bit heavier on allies. I run 30. I mentioned I usually aim for 20 to 30, and in this deck I angled more toward 30. And the reason is because Celeborn has synergies for allies. And in addition, at this point in the cycle of the game, I didn't consider the life cycle of the game. I didn't think that there were very good attachments available for this synergy. So I run heavily on allies in this deck. Now, one more ally that I considered very strong for willpower is Arwen, because of her 2 willpower for 2 cost and additional benefit of granting shields. Now, other candidates for willpower, Ether Swordsmen, they're very strong on willpower. I did not run them in this deck because of their low synergistic value and their fragility. They have only 1 HP. I would run them in decks where I need to go pedal to the metal with willpower, but that's not the case in this deck. I need willpower, but I could get away with running a hero like Bjorn who has 0 willpower, so you don't have to go pedal to the metal with a card like Ether Swordsman, who's a card that really boosts your willpower but dies easily. There's also cards like Westroad Traveler that have good willpower, but they have 0 other stats and it's very fragile. So I'll run cards like that that have good willpower but are very fragile if I have to. But generally I'll stay away from them unless I have to. I like them to have some secondary ability. It doesn't have to be strong, but some secondary ability is good. So I've chosen the allies that are synergistic with good willpower, and I've chosen the allies that are just flat good with willpower. If we look at the list of other allies that have strong willpower, strong meaning you get willpower equivalent to the cost of the ally, you'll see that there aren't really any that I didn't include, except for Escort from Edoras, but that's a temporary effect. Ether Swordsman, which I talked about already, being fragile, Westward Traveler. But there is no other ally which offers equivalent willpower to its cost and isn't useless in other areas. I've already included all of them in this deck. And at this point in the game's life cycle, that's not many. And we're only at 15 allies. So we start looking into niche use allies. Allies that don't have willpower equivalent to their cost, but are useful in other ways. Now, in playing this deck, I discovered that Bjorn is a great tank, but he racks up damage very quickly and dies, and then you're sunk. And so I included the card Landroval to account for that challenge, because he can bring Bjorn back to life after Bjorn dies. Another specific challenge to the deck, the Trisphere deck in general, is a weak turn 1, and it's weak turn 1 because you'll note that there's only one cost ally. The others all cost 2, and you can't play a 2 cost ally on turn 1. To help smooth out the resource curve a little bit, I included the card Envoy of Pelargir, which is a neutral card, which means it can be played on turn 1 for 2 resources, because you can spend resources from any sphere to do it. And it only costs 1 because it generates 1 resource for a Gondor or Noble hero afterwards. So it was included to overcome this specific challenge of smoothing out the resource curve of a Trisphere deck. These specific challenges you're not necessarily going to recognize before the game. Generally speaking, when I'm building a deck, a lot of times what I do is I'll just go through and include all the strong allies, and then maybe a selection of lesser allies if I need to improve the deck, and then I'll try playing it, and I'll identify deficiencies, and that's when I include tech cards. So I didn't build this deck this way on the first try. I built the deck in a more generic way on the first try and played it, and then discovered, oh, I need X because this situation is not good and I want to fix it, and this ally will help with that. And so in this case, the situations I wanted to fix were having nothing to do on turn 1. That's why I put in Envoy of Pelargir. And Bjorn dying. That's why you put in Landroval. Sometimes you encounter a challenge that can't be fixed, in which case you may have built a deck that's no good. But in this case, I felt that the challenges this deck faced could be fixed, and that's why I included these allies in order to fix the challenges. Now, I also found in playing this quest that I needed a little more defense, so I included the strongest defensive ally, Defender of Ramas, and I also found that I often didn't have anything to spend Bjorn's resources on, and resources just sitting there with no use is inefficient, and so I included an ally that both helps defend and could take advantage of Bjorn's dead resources. And that was Defender of Ramas. And then at this time I was also including Feely and Keely combined with the event card, A Very Good Tale. And the objective of that is cost reduction. And the challenge I was trying to overcome with that was that I was not getting cards out fast enough, and part of that was from Trisphere, and part of that was a limitation of resource generation. At this point in the game, all there really was Steward of Gondor. I also included the event card Good Harvest, once again to help overcome the weakness of the Trisphere deck, which is inefficient resource usage. And it's slow to get things out in the early game, but Good Harvest allows you to get things out faster. So that's the 30 allies that I included in this particular deck and the reasons why I included them. Let's move on to the next deck. The next hero combination is Bjorn, Baragon, and Boromir, and that was the combination of heroes I used for the Siege of Caer Andros. Here is the deck that I include for the Siege of Caer Andros. It is a siege questing deck. It is designed to go through the quest, the Siege of Caer Andros, siege questing the entire time. And so the first priority in building this deck was not willpower, it was shields, which was the stand-in for willpower in this quest. This was even earlier in the game's life cycle, so fewer sets were available. As before, there's no synergies to speak of here with these heroes, so as before, I would simply look at strong questing allies to start from the spheres that I'm playing, and that is just tactics in this one. Though I did still include Faramir, because as I said, I consider that ally so strong that I include him in almost every quest, and you did have to do some normal questing in this quest, so I included Faramir for that reason. But other than that, we just go down to tactics and we're looking at allies with strong shields. Can't use Bjorn, we're running Bjorn as a hero. So the cards that I looked to first were the ones where you get 2 shields, or in this quest, 2 questing power. 4 shields for 2 cost. That's amazing. So I immediately include those. Also Winged Guardian for the same reason. So then we're just going through the list of tactics allies primarily and looking for generally strong allies, because there aren't really any others that give you the required 2 for 2, except for Watcher of the Bruinen, who I also included, because it gives you 2 shields for 2 cost. That's 2 questing power for 2 cost, and that's great. Then we're just going through and looking for allies that are generally strong. I included Vassal of the Windlord for its attack value. This quest was also heavy on battling. I found I needed more attack power. Being so heavy on shields didn't give me enough ability to kill enemies, and so I included Vassal of the Windlord for that reason. I was also running Eagle synergies in this deck with support of the Eagles, which allows you to get 4 shields from this ally to a hero. It's like an additional 4 questing power every turn. And Vassal of the Windlord allowed you to do that with attack power also if needed, and also it could be drawn with the Eagles are coming. So that's the reason why it had. So once I chose the ally that was strong on sieging, then I chose other cards around it to either support it, because I didn't have enough sieging allies and I needed more siege power. So I chose cards to support Winged Guardian, and then Vassal of the Windlord made sense to include based on the cards that I chose to support Winged Guardian. Also included 1 copy of Land Revolve for the same reason as in the previous deck. It's to revive Bjorn. Also included Eagles of the Misty Mountains for the same reason as Vassal of the Windlord. It made sense to include with the cards that I included to support Winged Guardian. And I also included Gandalf. As always, he's pretty much an auto-include, and that got me to 21 allies, and that was enough for this deck with the attachments that I was running. So this is an example of a quest where I did not have enough cards to get the questing power that I wanted, and so I included attachments and events to support the best questing cards in this deck, being Winged Guardian and Defender of Vermoss, but Defender of Vermoss didn't really have any support cards. Winged Guardian did, being the Eagles are coming and support of the Eagles, and so I included those cards, and then once those were included and I needed more allies, it made sense to include the other Eagles because they're synergistic with the cards that support Winged Guardian. So let's move on to the next deck. The final deck is a Monosphere lore deck that I used for Nin in Eilf. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation of that. It probably isn't. Merlond, Grima, and Aragorn. So let's take a look at that. here is the deck. This was very heavy on allies. I included Forest Snare in this deck, which didn't make sense. I didn't know it at the time because I didn't know every card in the encounter deck. There actually isn't a target for it in this quest. So I'd remove 3 copies of that and put in 1 more Gleowine. Let's take a look at the reasoning for the allies in this one. So once again, we've got our selection of adventure packs and expansions that were in saga boxes that were available at the time of this release. And I selected my heroes for this quest, which were a Monosphere lore build. And the reason that I chose that selection of heroes for this quest was simply that I wanted to try it. I wanted to run traps like Ranger Spikes. I didn't know if it would be good or not. I wanted to try it, and I tried it, and it was fun, and it beat the quest. So that was, you know, sometimes when you're trying to figure out how to beat a quest, you just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So I started throwing stuff at the wall, and this stuck, and I liked it, so I played it. So this selection of heroes starts at 26 threat, and once again we're going into selecting heroes for questing, and Faramir is almost an auto-include for me, as is Core Gandalf. And then we start looking at the lore cards, which might be good for questing. Now I'm running Grima in this deck, so I included Isengard Messenger, because Grima is raising threat from the doomed keyword almost every turn, and that gets Isengard Messenger to 2 willpower for 2 cost almost every turn, with the option to go up to 3, although I don't think I had any other ways to do the doomed keyword in this deck, but still 2 cost for 2 willpower is great, and so I included this ally. Now, lore doesn't have a lot of strong willpower at this point in the game. I don't think there are really any allies that have willpower equivalent to their cost at this point. This adventure pack released just after the road darkened, so Elrond was available, and he did have 3 willpower for 3 cost. However, he's a non-permanent effect, and so I did not count him unless I wanted his response, which in this case I didn't. But I don't think there were any other lore allies that give you equivalent willpower to their cost, except for Erebor Record Keeper, and that's a 1/1, and I usually look past those, wanting at least 2 willpower for 2 cost, because 1 for 1 is okay early game, but it really falls off hard in the late game. So I went immediately into selecting allies for their niche value. I selected Gildor and Glorian simply because he's 3 willpower, even though it's 5 cost, which is quite expensive. He also has good secondary stats, so I chose him. I chose Gleowine for his card draw. I chose Haldir for his 2 willpower for 4 cost. That's a terrible ratio of willpower to cost, but I was so starved for good cards running Monosphere lore at this point in the game that he seemed good, even in spite of his limitation. I usually like to run 2 copies of unique allies instead of 3, except really important ones. I guess I considered Gildor really important in this one. It could have been a result of playtesting, or it could have been a result of not thinking about it when I built the deck. I'm not really sure. Then I also used Ithilien Lookout, which allows you to look at the top card of the encounter deck. If it's an enemy, you can discard it. I was running traps and thinking about enemy control in this one, and that's what I thought. That was my thinking for Ithilien Lookout. Master of the Forge, I love in a lore deck if you're running attachments, and I was running 18 in this deck. So that's a very helpful card because it draws 1 card every turn when you play it. And I was running Rivendell Minstrel as well for questing power, because as I've noted with the allies in this sphere right at this point in the game, they're very light on willpower, and so my strategy for questing was to run Sword That Was Broken on Aragorn. And in order to reliably use that, I wanted the Rivendell Minstrel in order to fetch Song of Kings, so that I could get out Steward of Gondor and Sword That Was Broken and Faramir, which was my questing strategy, because the allies were so light on willpower. If I have a deck that I want to play where the allies are particularly light on willpower, I like to run 2 or maybe 3 if it's available, more sources of willpower. And in that case, this was Faramir, who gives 1 to everyone, and Sword That Was Broken, that gives 1 to everyone. And the last ally that I included was Warden of Healing. I think this was to overcome a specific challenge in the deck. I don't remember specifically, but my best guess is I included this ally to overcome a specific challenge in the deck. It's also possible with this ally, I don't usually like to run healing, so I may have included this to overcome a challenge. I may have simply arrived at the end of the deck building process and couldn't think what else to include. And so I thought, well, I'll give that a try and see how it works. So it may have been a card I was playtesting. Sometimes I'll use 1 card slot in a deck for a card that I'm not sure about and I want to see how it works. And that may have been the case with Warden of Healing. It's also possible it was to overcome a specific challenge in this encounter deck, but usually I don't like to include healing cards, and so my guess is I was testing this card and or it was for a specific challenge. So none of these cards are strong on questing, and as a result I had to include Faramir and Sword That Was Broken, and I included cards to facilitate that. That's my thinking for the allies in this one. So hopefully that gives some insight into the process for selecting allies. And hopefully there's something here that will help newer players or returning players to consider how allies are chosen for deck building. This is not the only philosophy that works. Of course, it's simply the one that works for me and the thought process that I use in building decks when I build an original deck for a quest, which is not always. Sometimes I net deck, but typically I will at least modify the decks that I use. I don't think I've ever used a carbon copy of a deck, except perhaps for the Escape from Dol Guldur deck. But the other decks were all at least partially original, and this is the philosophy that I use in building them. So thanks for watching.